Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this Zoom talk at RASBJ. We've got, I think, a fair number of people still yet to come in, but thank you to those who have come in already. So I think we'll start. Before I introduce our moderator, Lucas Gaidos, who will introduce our speaker, Nick Kitto, may I just mention 3 small house rules. One is that you will all be muted, but you're welcome to show your face on your screen if you like to. This meeting is being recorded. And the third is that if you have questions, please post them on the chat function on Zoom addressed to everyone so that the moderator can pick them up and put them to our speaker. So a big welcome, first of all, if I may, to Lucas Gaidos, who was for many years on the council of Royal Asiatic Society, Beijing, and has now left China for an exalted post with the EU diplomacy in Indonesia. We're very pleased that he is being the moderator for this event, because we know that he has traveled a lot inside China and indeed is traveling a great deal inside Indonesia and Southeast Asia now. So we're expecting an interesting talk from him in due course. But meanwhile, Lucas, over to you to introduce Nick Kitto.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for those kind words, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, perhaps to some of you connecting from more afar. Thank you, Alan, for your kind words of introduction, and it is a real honor for me to introduce Nick Kitto, who is a marvelous photographer, but also, I think, a great researcher and someone with a great story to tell. He is based in Hong Kong, but made as many as 51 journeys all over China to uncover what is left of the former treaty ports, which are, of course, by their nature and by their history, controversial based on unequal treaties, which is something which is ultimately deplorable. But at the same time, these places have produced a lot of a treasure trove of architectural heritage, which is something that Nick spent so much time and effort recording. And you know, the outcome of his book, of his effort, is a wonderful book, which I managed to stumble upon during peak days of COVID-19 pandemic. Trading Places, a photographic journey through China's former treaty ports. I was lucky enough to order the book in early January 2021.
70%. Connected to
and
PC.
oh, someone is not unmuted. Please mute yourselves. And it was a real discovery. So when I heard a podcast, Nick featuring in a podcast by RTHK Radio 3 Hong Kong Heritage in August this year, I got in touch with Alan and recommended Nick as our speaker, because he really has a wonderful story to tell. And I have spoken for far too long now. Just one last thing that I would like to mention: we will post a link to Nick's book in the chat, and Nick has a wonderful presentation prepared for you and a wonderful story to tell. So please, Nick, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Lucas, thank you very much. And thank you also, Alan, for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. 15 years ago today, I was about 5 weeks short of retiring after 35 years in the accounting profession, retiring a little early from my partnership with one of the international accounting firms in Hong Kong. And the reason, or the primary reason I wanted to retire early, was I wanted to concentrate on photography, which had been a passion of mine since I was very young. I hadn't really thought I was going to get so involved in treaty ports, but as you'll find out later as I go through my talk, that's what happened. And it turned into a journey of discovery of the buildings that remain, and also discovering the role my family played during this important, during this era. So what I'm going to do, normally I would start at being an accountant, of course, and normally I would start at the beginning, but this time I thought I'd make a change and start by giving you a bit of an appetizer to get you warmed up a little bit and just show you some of the buildings we discovered on our journey of some 10 years. So to kick off with, one of my favorite buildings that's actually on the cover of the book is the Custom House in Guangzhou. This was built in 1914. It was the second iteration of the building because the first one was burnt down by a fire in around 1911, 1912. And I'm going to go through this quite quickly just to give you an idea of what was involved. Moving up to Shanghai, number one, the Bund, the McBain building, more commonly known as the Shell, or even more commonly known as the Asiatic building, because the Asiatic Petroleum Company North Limited rented the whole building except for the second and third floor, and we'll come back to APC later. Behind it is the Great Northern Telegraph Company building, and next door, number two, the Bund, is the Shanghai Club. You'll note that, I mean, this photo was taken around 2017, but you'll notice how clean the buildings are, and the whole of the Bund and more besides was done up in the lead up to Expo 2010 in Shanghai, and so I benefited from that. But let's keep moving. This is the Shanghai Club lobby. Now, if you'd been here in this position in the early 90s, you'd be looking down on a Kentucky Fried Chicken store, and you'd be standing with your back to what was a rather grubby, noisy, rowdy Seamen's Club. But it's now been fully restored to its original specs, I should say, and is part of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which rises up completely behind it. And there's a small access point in the back of the club building. Another favorite is Butterfield and Swire's Hazelwood. This was their Taipan's house in Shanghai. They actually had a compound of 5 houses for senior staff. And they're all now obviously still in the same compound, but they're now part of the Radisson Plaza Hotel. This was the Taipan, so it was by far the biggest of the 5, and I rather like this view because it lets you see the very distinctive copper roof that is on it. More copper, and this time we're still in Shanghai, but we're now on the lower part of the bell tower of the General Post Office. There's 2 identical, well, not identical, but there's 2 sculptures like this, one on each side. This is Hermes, the god of the messenger of the gods, I should say, amongst his other roles. And we know it's that because you can see the wings on his ankles and also on his helmet. Either side of him is Calliope, who's one of the Greek muses in Greek mythology, and they're already, it's the statue, 2 statues of the same individual, but they're ready to write letters. And here we have the vaulted ceiling of St. Joseph Cathedral in Jinan. Now, as you well know, during the 1960s, churches in particular got terrible treatment from the Red Guards, and all of them lost their stained glass windows as an absolute minimum. Now, this particular building at that time, although it had always been a cathedral, was being used as a sandpaper factory. And we know that it was received less attention, but what I can't tell you is whether those stained glass windows are original or whether they're replacements. Another ceiling, this time the bottom of the canopy of the decorative pavilion in Victoria Park, or Jiefang North Park, as it's now known, in Tianjin. This was, the park is a very small park that was in front of the Gordon building, or the main municipal building in Tianjin in the British concession. It's also in front of the Astor Hotel, which we'll look at shortly. But again, the colors and everything have all been restored and are looking wonderful. Further north still, Yokohama Specie Bank, once a bank, always a bank, and it's now a branch of the Bank of China. As you may know, this was originally a Russian concession, but the Japanese fought a war against Russia almost entirely on Chinese soil, I should add, apart from the naval battles, and defeated the Russians in 1905. And one of the terms of the surrender was that Dalian would become a Japanese concession. Japanese wisely decided to just adopt the plans that the Russians had already made for the development of the new city. And so you'll still see, even though they're built by Japanese, that there's still a sort of Russian theme to many of the buildings. And last but by no means least, way back down to the southwest of the country into Yunnan. This is a railway station on the French-built Haiphong to Kunming Railway, and that was truly a magnificent feat of engineering, because the terrain they had to go through, if there wasn't a ravine which they had to bridge, there was a mountain that they had to tunnel. But the railway is still in use. As you can see, there's sort of worn track marks in the further track. The nearer track is not in use. Well, presumably that's why someone's drying his corn without any fear of being trampled on by a train. Okay, so now I should traditionally go back to the beginning. The beginning took place from November 1996 to December 2007. That's quite a long beginning for anything, but bear in mind that I was still working in those days. And so things happened quite slowly, but they happened in a positive manner. Now, my father was born in Tianjin in 1925. He had an older sister called Patricia, which everyone called Paddy. His parents had been married in Niuchuang. That we knew, and we have this photo, obviously. My grandfather, Jack Kitto, had been recruited direct from his public school on the Isle of Man by the by Royal Dutch Shell. And he spent a year in their London office learning some basic procedures before being sent out to join the Asiatic Petroleum Company North Limited, which, as you already know, was headquartered in Shanghai. And he was sent out as a management trainee, and he arrived in around 1912. But of my grandmother's family, we know or knew very little indeed. Part of that was because she died very suddenly at the youthful age of 66, and no one had had a chance to talk, well, no one had thought to talk to her about her family's time in China. We knew that her father, Colin Ford, had worked for Jardine Matheson. We knew he was a Scotsman, and we assumed he'd been recruited from Scotland to join Jardines, which of course had a Scottish heritage as well. But quite frankly, that we didn't know anymore, although she was much loved. It broke my heart when she died. I was at prep school, and I was really heartbroken when the headmaster had the unenviable task of telling me that my grandmother had died. But apart from anything else, back in 1996, there was no one really worried or cared about it. It didn't seem important that we didn't know anything about the family's time in China. And then my grandfather came to live with us, and we didn't talk to him. So we didn't even know about the Kitto's time in China either. So it's a bit of a disaster area. But anyway, back in 1996, never mind, I was busy working, and I was on holiday, well, visiting my father in November 1996. And I mentioned 2 weeks after that, I'd be going up to Tianjin with a client. And he said, well, wouldn't it be a laugh if you found our old house? And he quickly or later proceeded to draw this little sketch on the top of a copy of one of his birth certificate, or a copy of his birth certificate. And it was seemingly quite in a prominent position because it was on Racecourse Road, and it was at a point where two roads joined Racecourse Road, and the old American barracks had been based there, which of course they wouldn't be now or back then. But no matter, I must admit, I went to Tianjin thinking, well, it'd be a bit of luck if we find it. But find it I did. Now this building is very large and it's semi-detached, so in theory, I might have had trouble wondering which side of the house was ours, because it was exactly in the position that my father had described. But he also told me that you didn't enter the house through the front door. The main entrance, the front door as it was on the left-hand side, up a few steps. And you can maybe just see that on the left-hand side, there's the sort of the arch of the doorway. So that really helped me to identify the building. And the family was there from about 1925 to 1931. And bear in mind, my father was only about, well, may have been nearly 6 or just about 6 when they left in 1931. My grandfather was transferred to Hankow to take over the office there. So the fact that he remembered the detail he did was quite amazing. But anyway, I was happy with the find. My father was delighted. And so next year, he was so delighted, he gave me a second challenge. And I was going back to the Tianjin again with the same client. And he said, right, you found the house, now find the Tianjin Country Club. Okay, well, I've got nothing else to do, but I'll do that. And find it we did. 4th of December, 1997. We owed the find to the limo driver, the hotel limo driver, who knew, I'd showed him the photograph and he knew exactly where it was. In fact, if I'd been a bit more knowledgeable, the Tianjin Country Club was actually the Tianjin Country Club and Racing Club. And so if I'd known that, I could have just found it myself, because obviously all you needed to do was to go down Racecourse Road to the end, and presumably you would be presented with the racecourse. But anyway, no matter. We found that, and now I was becoming interested. I really was becoming interested about these treaty ports, because I'd only looked for 2 buildings and found them both, and they were still there. So I started to read up on them, on treaty ports. And then on a very memorable journey back, I took my father in November 2004 back to Tianjin. We arrived in Tianjin quite late. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we checked in. And there was still time enough, I thought, to go out to at least see the house. And by a wonderful coincidence or happening or occurrence, whatever you want to call it, it was a bar. So presumably the house hadn't quite got over the boozy kiddos from their residential days back in the 1920s, because the living room and dining room was now a bar. So we went into the house that he hadn't been into for 75 years and had a G&T, as one does. Very memorable occasion, of course, quite emotional too. Of course, this was the next day, the photo op was the next day. And after this, we went to the country club, and there a very understanding caretaker, once she heard of the family connection, showed us around the country club. But I'll come back to that later. And now the other thing we did is we spent some time walking around the city centre, and the place was packed with old Western style buildings. Some of them were huge, really big. And this really interested me. Now, back in Hong Kong, a very good friend of mine, Robert Neild, who was far more knowledgeable by then on the treaty ports and was also very interested in the treaty ports. I kept him informed of what we'd found and what we'd done. And well, again, 15 years ago, I suggested to him Robert, why don't we just go up to Tianjin for a few days? I'm winding down. I've got nothing to do at work. Let's go up and I'll show you the old house and the club, and I'll show you everything I've found in Tianjin. So we went there and we stayed in the Astor Hotel. It looks a bit grotty outside, but it was quite atmospheric and old inside. And we had a very good look around. And on the third evening, the night before we flew back to Hong Kong, we decided that we have now had a project that we, over the next few years, which soon turned into 10, we would visit as many of the treaty ports as we could. And he would write about it and I would photograph the buildings we found. So that's what we did. The journey, April 2008 to June 2018. Now I'm showing you this map for two reasons. Firstly, it'll show you the extent of our travels. Very covered certainly all the main treaty ports without doubt. Occasionally we would go back twice to a place together. Like for example, we went back to Hankow twice and used it as a base for visiting Shashi, Yichang, and also Jiujiang and Lushan. But of course, I went back many times, not to the smaller ones, but I had to go back to Shanghai, the bigger ones, Qingdao, Shanghai, Guangzhou, even Hankow. I went back, and Tianjin, of course. I went back 5 or 6 times to those places, except for Hankow. I think I only went there for one extra visit. The other reason I want to show this to you is very important. This really is important to me, is that I want you to find these buildings, should you be interested in finding them, of course. And so this is actually a high-level view of a Google Earth layer that if you have the book, there's a QR code that will take you so you can download the layer. And if you drill down into the cities, you'll find, and it's all obviously indexed, you'll find every single building that's in the book, plus a few more. And I can assure you, I spent a lot of time on it. So you will land on the roof of that building. It's not going to be just a rough estimate, it's bang on the roof. So I'm very keen for people to find the building. Whoops. I should not show you. What I need to say next is that we worked very hard, and our modus operandi was to have a big breakfast, leave the hotel about 8:30, 9 o'clock latest, and we would walk throughout the day. There was no point getting in a car and trying to do this. You'd only miss everything. So we walked throughout the day, no lunch, occasionally to celebrate a very interesting find. We might treat ourselves to an ice cream. But it was hard work, but it was a huge amount of fun. And but we would try and be back at the hotel by 6 o'clock, and then we'd head off to either down to the hotel bar, or in this case, we headed out to the International Club in Qingdao for a couple of beers. We would talk about the day's work, and more importantly, we would talk about what we were going to do the next day. Now, I can assure you, by June 2013, we'd found so much that these were two very happy chaps indeed. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time on restorations. Now, you've seen this photo before, but I wasn't the first person to photograph treaty port buildings. In the early 90s, a Shanghai-based photographer, Dick teamed up with the former American diplomat, Tess Johnston, and they did very much what we were doing in 2008 and onwards. But as you can see, they were in the early 90s. Now, in the early 1990s, this building, as it stands, would have been considered in very good condition. And they've done an awful lot of books, and there's some terrific photographs and terrific coverage in their books. But the buildings are mostly very tired. and some of them are sort of falling apart, literally. We got very lucky. I don't know whether it's because of the timing of the Olympics in 2008, so that some of the host cities like Qingdao and Tianjin did themselves up. Certainly Shanghai did its Bund up. Wonderful job on the Shanghai Bund in good time for Expo 2010. But wherever we went, we found the buildings had been largely restored and restored to a very high standard. So perhaps the Beijing Olympics or the lead up to the Beijing Olympics got things started. And then others followed suit because they thought, oh, well, we've got some of those. Why don't we do the same? But anyway, here's the Tianjin Country Club after a restoration in 2014. Now that's what I call a restoration. It's better perhaps seen from this shot. You can see the quality of the brickwork that's been repaired and polished up and everything, and probably exposed properly. Wonderful, wonderful work. And this small plaque here, Tianjin was always subject to bad flooding, but that plaque marks the high water point of the floods in August, September 1939. So you can imagine how bad those floods were. And inside now it's all nice and clean. When I was there with my father, it was very dusty. It was a bit like walking into a dusty time capsule, because if you went down the stairs on the right there, you'd go into or the area where the billiards room were, and they were still marked, the billiards room, and the tables were there. They were covered, but the cupboards were covered in their turn with dust and bits of plaster that had come off the ceiling. The swimming pool was an empty concrete shell that was being used for storage. Here it is now, once more back as a proper swimming pool. The bowling alley bar, we've got a bowling alley bar in the Hong Kong club, beg your pardon. The bowling alley was fully restored. We didn't see any of that in 2004. But there was a squash court. The squash court was restored and is being used as a squash court. Really is a great job, and it's a club once more. Okay, again, you've seen this, the Astor Hotel, but if there's one building that if I was asked, what's the best single restoration you've seen? Well, I must admit, it'd be a bit of a close competition between the country club that you've just seen and the Astor Hotel. Again, both in Tianjin. Now, have a look at the tower. I realize it's largely hidden, but the tower is important because soon after we checked out in November 2007, in early 2008, they closed the hotel to restore it. When it reopened, that's what it looked like. And I can't show you an old photo because I have them, but they're really a bit, the resolution's terrible. So I'm not going to attempt to show you them, but I can assure you that's exactly as well, ignoring the two large concrete things behind. That's exactly how the hotel looked in the 1920s. Now I've got quite a lot of history on the Astor Hotel, and it's had an interesting history, and there's this kind of a sad but happy story attached to it. But if there's time later, we can always come back to that. But you didn't have to do a complete restoration because a lot of the buildings were already very good. Now, when I saw this in June 2010 on our first trip to Hankow, I thought this building looked jolly good. Obviously, you can still see its name, the French bank, and it's in very good condition. It's not too bad a color and all the rest of it. We went back in November 2012. Feast your eyes on that. Now that's another terrific restoration. I'm only talking about one or two buildings here. There's hundreds of them all over the mainland. Before we move on, I just want to cover one more restoration. Now, this is a favorite one of mine. This is the the British consulate in Tengchong, which is way down on the border virtually with what was called Burma and Myanmar these days in Yunnan province. Now, you'll remember in 1941, well, 1942 in particular, Japanese came up through Burma and basically threw the British out of the country. And they started probing later into both India and also to China. And I feel really sad in a way because the war in this theater was really ferocious. And it's very little known. I mean, in the UK, the Burmese campaign, which of course involved China as well, is referred to as the Forgotten War, and it really shouldn't be forgotten. But anyway, I digress. This building was in the way of the Japanese advance, and it was shot to pieces on one side because it was very well built, and obviously it was being used as a strong point by the Chinese troops. And the photo down the bottom there, bottom left, was taken by a Swedish missionary after the Chinese had withdrawn. But before long, the Chinese counterattacked, and they came back, and once again, this building found itself heavily involved, and of course, it got shot to bits on the other side of the building. But they've restored it, and yet they haven't, because they've left all the bullet marks there. Isn't that terrific? I think that's great. And I might add, I'm amazed that those two chimneys survived. How they survived, I simply can't understand, but those are the original chimneys. A closer look at the bullet marks there. We couldn't get in to the building because the restoration seemed to have stalled, and seemed to have stalled for quite a while because it was very dusty and there was sort of growth of plants growing all over the place on the outside. Although I've actually only just noticed that there's something in the inside there. The smaller parts, the smaller part, the annex bit, would have been the office, whereas the bigger part obviously was the residence. And so there's something in the office building there. But this is the living room. I mean, it looks lovely in its own way, but one would have expected for the things to proceed, but clearly health and safety have managed to get in because there's a fire extinguisher there. Okay, now we've seen a lot of very fine buildings, and you need to bear in mind that all of these, or many of these buildings, would have been in their second or even third iteration, and they would have been much smaller and much grubbier in the early days of the treaty ports. And at the beginning, what typically happened would be the British consul, and I say British because most of the treaty port, by far the majority of the treaty ports were British, at least to begin with, would be dispatched to a new treaty port. The town or city authorities will have been told to find him accommodation, and of course they seldom did that. And the new consul, if he was lucky, was treated with a high degree of suspicion. And in some cases, the local population was outwardly hostile towards him. And to give you an idea, that the new consul of Fuzhou, which is one of the first 5 treaty ports, he was eventually given a property that was some way conveniently distant from the city, on the other side of a river. And his accommodation flooded at high tide. Now, he had been a missionary, so he may well have noticed, may have well had to deal with harder conditions than that. But the Hong Kong governor, when he came on a visit, had an absolute fit, and eventually he was moved into a disused temple until proper accommodation could be built. The Yichang, the new consul, British consul for Yichang, faced a totally different situation. He arrived and he was warned that he better stay a little while on his boat, because the city authorities up until then had a bounty out for foreigners. So bring me a foreigner's head and you'll get some money. Very prudently, the consul stayed on the ship. And of course, eventually the city authorities assured him that it was safe for him to step on dry land, but you can imagine how he felt, probably wondering whether there was someone around that hadn't got the memo. Anyway, he survived, but some sympathy is due to the first British consul in Beihai, previously known as Pak Hoi. This was a fisherman's shack on stilts. You can almost hear the estate agent, can't you? Perfect, wonderful seafront property, full sea view. You've got steps down to your private beach, mooring for your yacht, and of course, a stable for your horse. Well, the consul's accommodation was perhaps the least of his worries then, because Beihai is well down in the tropics, and it had virtually, well, indeed, it had every disease known to man that could kill you was in the air. The plague was endemic. And there was also trouble from pirates, because this is one of the few ports, Chinese ports, that was actually on the coast. There are other examples, of course, but mainly Chinese ports were up a river several miles inland, simply to avoid trouble from the pirates. But eventually, in 1885, can you imagine having to put up with that fishing shack until 1885? Funds were generously released for the consul to build himself a decent consular office and combine with his residence. Now, I'm rather happy to sort of be able to use this as an example, because in 1999, this building was in the way of a dual carriageway that was needed to improve. Sorry, I'm just checking my time. Needed to improve the traffic flow. So rather than knock it down, which is clearly what may have happened in many places, the building was lifted up, put on rails, and moved 55.8 meters to the southeast and put down, and is now in the entrance to a secondary school. Okay, let's talk a little bit about family. Wuhu, let's go to Wuhu first. Wuhu, wonderful name. It's so impressed, for those of you that are interested in old films, it's so impressed W.C. Fields that he used it as a setting for his 1933 film, International House. It was opened under the Chifu Agreement. It's just upriver from Nanjing, as I've said there. It's about a 2-hour drive. Missionaries were very active in the area, but they were further downriver, further north, a little bit further, certainly some distance from the concession area. It was a busy center, a very busy center for timber and rice, and that, of course, is what was the attraction to the foreign traders. They wanted to get in on these two products, and they had high hopes for it. The local merchants, of course, had a different view. But firstly, let's look at the customs properties. The top right-hand building is the custom commissioner's residence. I should probably call it mansion. The building beneath it was the deputy commissioner's residence. Very nice indeed too. Perhaps he had to share that. I don't know, but perhaps he did. And you now see the custom house, well placed, looking out over the Yangtze River. It was the second custom house because, well, the first one was built inland, or had been located inland, and was up a creek, which is pretty well where the foreign traders were, because they were essentially squeezed out by the locals, understandably. And the way they did that is that in order to get to the old custom house, you had to pass from the concession area through the timber merchants' yards, and they weren't going to allow access for that purpose. So the would-be timber and rice merchants retired, to Shanghai or wherever they next thought they had hopes for. But what did succeed, what did impress the local merchants were the steamships, because they could get their products to where they wanted to be much quicker than using the local junks. So both Butterfield and Swire and Jardines had lots of land. I have to say I've found no evidence that Jardine Matheson actually did anything with their land. But as you can see here, this is the Butterfield and Swire site. They had 4 very large go-downs, and that small building there is the shipping office. You've got a bonus here because you've got a Royal Navy insect class gunboat that's visiting at the time this photo was taken, that incidentally comes from the G. Warren Swire collection of photographs. And the large ship in the middle was what is known as a hulk, which was a decommissioned ship that would be used for extra storage and more normally for accommodation, particularly on the top decks, for senior staff, or generally this would be probably for a treaty port of this side. It would just be for the agent, and he would lived on board the hulk, as they're called. In the 1890s, the Swire agent was a chap called William Alfred Howell, who'd been a master mariner and who'd brought out a newly built steamship for Butterfield and Swire in 1883. Because he also brought out his family with him, and he ultimately had 3 sons and a teenage daughter. At this point, we're really interested in the daughter, Elsie Laura Howell, who in the late 1890s was, well, mid 1890s, I should say, was 18 or approaching 18. And so naturally enough, her parents were worried about a possible hopeful marriage or husband for her. Around the corner, or further inland a bit, was the British Consulate office and residence, which had been built in 1887. A gentleman by the name of Colin Ford was the consul here during a similar period that the Howells were in Wuhu. They would have known each other. They would have been best friends because there was hardly any other European around. You could probably count on one hand, maximum 2 hands, the amount of Europeans that would have been in Wuhu at that time. Admittedly, there were the missionaries, but they were some way further out of town. Now, briefly, Colin Mackenzie Ford had actually been born in India. He'd been sent to boarding school in Aberdeen, and he'd gone to Aberdeen University, which happened to be one of the universities that Britain's China Consular Service used to recruit people. So instead of going back to India to probably join the Indian Civil Service, he agreed to join the China Consular Service, and he arrived in Shanghai in 1867. He was with that service until 1899. There's rather a lot of Collins around in my story, so I'll refer to this gentleman as Colin the Consul. His older brother had a son called William Richard Colin Ford, and he'd obviously written to Colin the Consul to ask if he could find a job. He too was in India, to ask if he would find a job for young Colin Ford in China, because he thought it had better opportunities for his son than remaining in India. In fact, he had 2 other sons that later ended up in China as well. So now we have young Colin and we have young Elsie Laura, and so a match. They were introduced to each other, and they were married in Wuhu on the 3rd of January 1899. Almost immediately, Jardines transferred them to the Jardines office in Yokohama, Japan. While they were, this photo was taken later once they'd moved to Yinkao, but they were in Japan for 9 years, and they had three children. The oldest, Barbara, at the rear. My future grandmother, Audrey, is on the floor, kneeling on the floor there, and a son, another Colin, were born in Yokohama, but they not long been moved to Yinkao or New Trang when young Edith, who's on her father's lap, arrived. They were in New Trang. They moved to New Trang in around 1908. That's my best estimate. So we now move to New Trang, or Yinkao as it's called. It's on the Lao River. It was opened in the wrong place under the Treaty of Tinsin in 1858. It was the wrong place because the British had asked for New Trang as opposed to Yinkao. And once they got there, it's about 50 kilometers northeast of Yinkao as the crow would fly. Along the river, it was a very much longer distance. And by the time the river, or should I say, at the point it was at New Trang, the river was completely silted up and the town had been abandoned. They probably could have got a clue from that, because I believe the English translation of New Trang is cow village. But anyway, not to be daunted by this, they then marched down to Yinkao, and the British consul stuck his flag in the soil at Yinkao and said, this place is now known as New Trang. The usual sort of arrogance that was prevalent in those days. And of course, he had a gunboat to back him up if anyone disagreed. So Yinkao became New Trang, but now happily it's back as Yinkao. Soya beans was the great attraction. It was also quite dangerous. It was bandit country, but soya beans was the great attraction. What they would do is they would, in these processing plants, they would press the soya beans to squeeze out, to extract the oil, which was very good for cooking. And the resulting mush was dried into cakes, bean cakes as they were called. And these were in great demand, particularly by the sugar farmers down in South China. So there was a lot of potential. Enter Butterfield and Swire. Butterfield and Swire bought bean cakes in Yinkao, shipped them down, sold them to the farmers for fertilizer, bought the sugar so produced, took it to its sugar refinery in Hong Kong, and then brought the refined sugar and sold it all the way up the China coast, and of course along the Yangtze. And then by the time they reached Yinkao, they had empty holds, so they would load up with bean cakes, and back the whole process would begin again. This single part of business was massively profitable, and they could squeeze everyone else out who tried it, because firstly they were there first, and secondly they had full holds both directions, and they could keep the prices very, very low indeed. And this line of business was probably the single line of business that enabled Butterfield and Swire to be established as a really successful business in China. It was certainly one of the three, if not three largest, if not the largest shipping companies in China in the day. Now there's a photo of the Lao River. It was ferocious at this point. It wasn't obviously up at the old town of New Trang, but it was ferocious at this point, and it would quite often destroy the bund, particularly after the winter melt. The river was in full force and it would destroy the bund, but it did freeze in winter, which presented its own problems. This is the custom house. Unusually for a custom house, no clock tower. This is certainly not the first custom house, because the first one would have been victim to at least one of the bund collapses at the hands of the Liao River. But it's probably the second, because eventually they were able to bund things up properly. Now I mentioned the bandits, and they were an issue. And during the spring, summer, and autumn, before the freeze, Britain was able to keep a gunboat docked, and that basically kept the bandits away because they didn't really want to tangle with Marines and heavy guns and so on. But in the winter, of course, a gunboat, if it'd been left in the water, would probably end up a bit like poor old Shackleton's Endeavour several years later and end up at the bottom of the river. Eventually, they came upon a fairly simple idea, and that was to build a dry dock so the gunboat could remain over the winter. The guns could be taken out off the boat, off the ship, and mounted on wheels in case they were needed to deal with bandits. We're nearly at the end. Spring of 1919, my grandfather, Jack Kitto, arrived from, he had actually been acting general manager in Yichang, which, if you remember, was the place where the bounty was out for foreigners. He obviously survived that. He arrived as assistant manager, and he was a really sporty chap. Probably that's partly what had attracted Shell to him at boarding school. This picture on the left is his horse, Dirty Dog, has just won the Autumn Cup, the 1919 Autumn Cup, and he's leading it in. A great shame I've got a crease right across his eyes, but I suspect his eyes may have been heavily shaded by his cap. He used to go, he was a very good shot with a shotgun, and there was plenty of game to shoot at in the marshes on the other side from the concession. Of course, as I've said, the river froze in the winter, so ice yachting was very popular. Frankly, I can't imagine anything more dangerous, but anyway, this is a very valuable to me. It's quite small, it's only 4 or 5 inches high, but a silver trophy that he must have won, having won a race in his ice yacht. And if he obviously kept himself busy, and if nothing else, there was always the New Chuang Club, which had been built well before he arrived. But he went on leave in 1920, and one of the few family stories I've got, which I haven't yet been able to verify, is that on his way back from leave in the summer of 1920, there was a young lady on the same boat, and they got on very well. And they got on so well that it was Audrey, and it was Audrey that he married. Now, of course, I've got a lot more than I used to have in 1996. I've got a lot of the history of the Ford family now. What we'd known in 1996 was all wrong. And I can now tell you that this gentleman here is young Colin, obviously not quite so young at the moment. I have a newspaper cutting from the North China Herald, and I have a second photograph. In fact, I've got more than 2 photographs. After many years, I've only just received this photograph, and after many years, I'd lost touch of my father's sister's family, and I'm now back in touch with her daughter, Kate, and she's got some, but not many photos, and I've just received this 2 weeks ago, and there's more to come. So thank you, Kate. And well, that sort of brings me to the end of my story. I hope I've been reasonably clear throughout to all of you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I mean, this has been a very, very impressive talk, not only due to its content. You took us on a real journey through time and space, combining your family's history with the story of China's treaty ports and the architectural heritage. And we have a lot of questions, so let me just go straight to them, if I may do so. I think Alan was the first one to ask a question, and commenting on the impressive restoration of the Tianjin Country Club. He asked whether you feel that any of the buildings that you you saw throughout your multiple journeys were over-restored, or the restoration wasn't done quite as well as it should have been? You know, something was lost in the process.
That's an excellent question, because it's not difficult to overcook the restorations process. I can't say I can't think of any. Frankly, there's probably some, but I can't think of any. But the complication we faced was sometimes these restorations are actually new builds, but they build them so well and so close to the original building that it's impossible to tell the difference. One example, I haven't got a photo of it, but one example is in Qingdao. The old German Qingdao station at Qingdao wasn't quite right in the right place, and it was really quite old. And they wanted to build a whole new main station there. So they built it, and they rebuilt. They didn't restore the station, they rebuilt it. And they're quite open about it. They added an extra couple of meters to the clock tower because it looked better that way, when it looked more in proportion to the rest of the building, the new building. But the original station, the original German station, is you can quite clearly see it, and that's been restored or rebuilt to the exact specifications, notwithstanding the comment I made just now about the clock tower. That was probably our greatest challenge, not so much that it was overcooked, the restorations were overcooked. They're all very well done, and I know Hong Kong uses the experience on the mainland. I've lost everyone. Are you still there, Lucas?
Yes, I am. I think we can hear you. All of us can hear you, and we can still see you. So please do continue.
Yeah. So that was our biggest challenge, working out what was original rather than what was a rebuild of something that was so good that it looked original. But I can't say, to answer the question simply, I cannot think of any restoration that was overcooked.
Thank you. Something you just mentioned is a great bridge to the second question. You mentioned the original, and the question is, who are the architects of these buildings? Would you have any insights or perhaps any interesting stories about the architects of the buildings that we've seen throughout your talk?
There was a Mr. Parnell from Australia who was responsible for a lot of the buildings in Guangzhou area. I always sort of hide behind my caveat that I'm neither historian nor architect. But to answer the question, there was a wide variety of architects. Well, for example, you saw the picture earlier of Hazelwood in the Swire Taipan's house in Shanghai. Now that was built by a very well-known Welsh architect, designed by a very well-known Sir Bertram Clough Williams Ellis. Now he designed that, and it was built without him actually visiting China, but he did one or two other buildings. But there were the architects were often dependent on which concession you were in. For example, Tianjin had 9 concessions, 9 different countries, so they'd have all brought in their own architects. Qingdao was German, so it's largely German architectural. But I haven't studied the architects, so I'm afraid I can't give you any sort of anecdotes about what they did. But they were very active, as you can see.
Thank you very much. We have another question. It's specifically on the Cultural Revolution and on the damage that any of these buildings sustained during the Cultural Revolution. And also the question continues, were there any that were specifically protected by the PLA, such as Zhou Enlai requested to protect the Bund in Shanghai?
Yeah, there's
Anything that you have come across?
some had limited protection apart from the bunds, but bear in mind these are heavy duty buildings. There's only so much Red Guards can do to demolish them. I mean, there was the story again in Qingdao of the St. Michael's Cathedral, which has two towers, and the Red Guards took offence at the two large crosses on, but they tried to climb up. These towers are very high, and they put rickety scaffolding up, and 2 or 3 of them fell off and killed themselves. At which point, the towers were the crosses were prudently removed and hidden. They were actually hidden so long that no one knew where they were, so they put 2 replicas up. Later, quite recently, actually, the waterwork company was doing some work, and they were digging a hole somewhere, and they actually found the original crosses. Another example of a property that was protected was the huge, massive governor's mansion in Qingdao, and it was protected largely because, well, only because Mao Zedong used to like to stay there on occasions. So there were the churches, of course, were all smashed up, but it tends to be the detail that was smashed up. Because these things by then, by 1960, by the end of the Treaty Port era, we were into the 2nd or 3rd iteration of these buildings, and they were heavy duty buildings, as you've probably seen from most of the photos I've shown. So they were quite hard to demolish. They were easy enough to break windows and things like that, but they were not easily demolished, which is why it's been really quite easy for them to be tidied up as they have been recently.
Thank you. We have a question from Bill Kwok, who is asking about how did you manage to gain access to buildings which were perhaps not accessible to the wider public, be it banks or official buildings, custom houses, etc., etc.
The simple answer to that is that we couldn't get access to many of the buildings because, well, the hotels are still hotels, the banks are still banks, the custom houses are still custom houses, all owned by the Maritime Customs Service. They're not always like for example, the Guangzhou Custom House is not the custom house in Guangzhou. It's a custom museum, which never seems to be open whenever we went there. Most places were difficult to get into, unless they were a hotel or something like the Shanghai Club or the clubs I could get into. Banks I could get into, but I wasn't allowed to take photos, obviously, in the bank. But we got into some. I used my family connections sometimes to get into buildings. I didn't abuse it. Where it was obviously occupied by a business, I didn't want to go in, barge in and try and interfere with their business because there'd be nothing much for me to see anyway. I mean, most of these buildings have been repurposed and are being used, although, as I said before, custom houses are custom houses, hotels are hotels, and so on. But we didn't get into a huge number of buildings, I have to say that.
I would perhaps just add that the fact that you were not able to access all of these buildings doesn't take away from the quality of the photos that you took.
No, I mean,
the book is filled with wonderful photos.
Oh, thank you. But where I have been able to get in, I've normally, it's normally in the book. Basically, where I got into inside a building, it's in the book. I got into the Butterfield and Swire building in the old French Bund in Shanghai. That was no difficulty at all. If I had enough people, I could, at the Radisson Plaza Hotel, I could rent out Hazelwood, but I would need to fill it with a few guests in order to be allowed to do that. So you can get in, and of course they're very good with family connections. Never mind the history and the background to these buildings and how they came to be. Like when with my father, as soon as the caretaker understood that he'd been a child in Tianjin, she just grabbed her huge key ring and off we went. Guided tour. It was terrific.
Thank you. Just a very quick question from, let me find it, from Sylvia, who's asking, when were the photos of Wuhu taken? When did you visit Wuhu?
Gosh, January 2013.
Okay, thank you. So that is your answer, Sylvia. We also have China Rail 1. I'm not sure what his or her name is, commenting on the level of service in the Astor Hotel and also in the Kiesling restaurant, which has supposedly gone down, especially in the restaurant and the bar. Well, I think that's regrettable.
Okay.
But what was your experience with staying in the Astor Hotel? Because I listened to some of the podcasts that you featured in, and I think you said that whenever you visited Tianjin, you would stay in the Astor Hotel, especially in the older wing. Is that correct? Would you perhaps like to elaborate on this?
Oh, well, it was when they restored it, the city authorities brought in an international hotel chain to manage it. And well, it was when I was last in Tianjin in 2014. It's the one place I really want to go back to because of the family connections, and there's some people I want to see there. It was a very high quality. Now, I spoke to a friend of mine not so long ago who'd been to the Astor Hotel. He wasn't staying there, but he went into the bar. This would have been 2018 or thereabouts, and he was very disappointed because there was apparently no wine. Now, I can't imagine why that would be the case, but so be it. That was what it is. It may have gone downhill, but it was, and as far as I know, is still in the hands of an international hotel chain. Now, Kiesling's is a different case. You don't go to Kiesling's, frankly, for the food. You go there to be in Kiesling's, if I can be so bold. It's not actually the original Kiesling's. It's the old Victoria Cafe. The original Kiesling's was in the German, the German concession further south. And what happened is that in the late 1930s, or maybe even 1940 or 41, perhaps, the owners of Kiesling's, which had probably changed from the original owner or the original partnership by then, he bought out the Victoria Cafe, and he basically moved the operation there. Now, I don't know the timing, but the original Kiesling's was at some point demolished. It's now a park, quite a large park, is sitting on the former site. Now, the Victoria Cafe, now Kiesling's, I've been there several times. In fact, we went there with my father, and my father mentioned that her Kiesling would not have been impressed with the food, but they've got their own microbrewery up on the third floor. The third floor is the sort of German theme, and then I think there's a French theme, and then there's the downstairs sort of general bakery and everything. I enjoyed I mean, it's, you know, they've got their own beer and everything, and the food wasn't good, but heck, you know, it was great to be in, because that was the original, that building was an original cafe back in the Treaty Port era. So it wasn't as if we were dealing with something that, you know, a new build with the name Kiesling's and Beta stuck on the front of it. It had been what it was and is now. Not the same standard, of course, but never mind.
Thank you. I'm very much aware of the passage of time, so let me perhaps merge three questions, the last three questions we have for today. One of them is whether you managed to visit Ningbo Another one is again from Bill Kwok, a follow-up, whether you sought any official assistance from the local authorities when visiting the former treaty ports. And perhaps let's give the last one to Alan. Which one is the most worth visiting with building that you saw?
All right, the first one, Ningbo, yes, of course we went to Ningbo. That was one of the first 5 treaty ports, and we spent 3 or 4 days there. Can't remember the exact date. It was around the time of the Mid-Autumn Festival, though, because I remember the lanterns were being let up into the air and everything. Official assistance, normally no, we didn't. We didn't need it, to be honest, because I mentioned Robert was well advanced in his studies. And he had a lot of old maps, and the roads may have been widened since the treaty port days, but they weren't changed. And what we used to do is we each of us, before we went on a trip, we would do our own research, and Robert would lend me his maps, and then we'd fly over the city we were about to visit on Google Earth, looking out for interesting looking red roofs or orange roofs, the classic sign of an old treaty port building. Compare it to the map, and then we'd mark it and make sure we visited it. And we found, as I said, or if I didn't, we always found what we went to look for. If we couldn't find it, it had been because it'd been demolished. So we didn't need to seek local help. I did once. Once. I was on Gulang Yu. I was on a visit. I wasn't with Robert, and Colin, the consul, had been there for 1 year, and Gulang Yu and his residence was there. The consul's residence was there, but we couldn't get in the gate. So when Robert and I were there, we couldn't get in the gate, and it was very frustrating because we could see the building quite clearly. And when I went there, I went inside to the city, the Gulang Yu authorities, which happened to be in the old British consulate office, and I asked to see the director. Fortunately, I had a Chinese, Mandarin-speaking friend with me, and also fortunately, the island had just applied for World Heritage status, which they subsequently secured. And I explained when the director came to see us, I was very fortunate because I just walked in off the streets, for goodness sake. And came to see us, and I kept it simple. I just said my great-grandfather, rather than my great-great-great-great-uncle, had been consul here for a year, and could I possibly see his residence? And he said yes. And he whistled up one of his translators and a historian, and the 4 or 5 of us marched off to the residence. They opened the gate, and in we went, group photographs, of course, and everything. We couldn't go inside the building, but that didn't matter. And so I was very fortunate to be able to achieve that. But in general, the answer is no, we didn't seek help. Frankly, city authorities, it would be nice to think that they would help us, but they've got far better things to do than to be A, reminded of the era, and B, to spend time with these 2 old fuddy-duddies trying to find old buildings. But final question, I think, was which city? Now, Puting is the most interesting. Putting aside my bias, because my father was born there. For those of you in Tianjin, for those of you in Beijing, my favorite choice would be to go to Tianjin. And these days, it's just a 20-minute zip down in the express train. In my day, says this old chap, we used to have to drive down through the Valley of Death, because that 2-hour road drive was terrifying. more recently, we were able to fly. There's a direct flight from Hong Kong to Tianjin. There was one every day. Obviously, that doesn't happen at the moment. But when I was with my client, and when I did a few additional visits before, and indeed with my father, we used to have to drive down the road. Eventually, it was turned into a dual carriageway, but the early drives were quite terrifying, especially in fog. But anyway, I'm still alive. But Tianjin would be my choice because it's got the most compressed number. It was number 2, or at least number 3, certainly not lower than number 3 in terms of trade and size. It had a lot of banking, a lot of finance because it was close to Beijing. So in terms of overall transactions, it was probably number 2 to Shanghai. And yet the buildings are all reasonably compressed. And the other thing is there are 9 concession areas. Can you believe? It's by far the largest number. No other treaty port has anything like 9. So you've got different types of architecture. You've got French, you've got German a little bit, you've got oh gosh, let me think, Austro-Hungarian, and you've got Italian architecture. Americans had a concession, but that was merged with the British. The Japanese had a concession, but that's largely been redeveloped. Belgium had a concession. They didn't do anything with theirs. But you've got a variety, and with the exception of the country club, the Cathedral de Notre Dame, and the West Rail Station, all of it is in, go and stay in the Astor Hotel for 3 or 4 days, and you'll be able to see all of it. If you want to go out to those 3 further places, and they are worth visiting, you best get a car because it's a bit of a long walk otherwise. But Tianjin gets my vote.
Thank you. And I think Tianjin also gets my vote. I was on exchange in Tianjin 11 years ago, and yeah, it is a really wonderful. It's all the different former concessions. I should also add that the first consul of the Austro-Hungarian legation was born on the same street as I was. I gave a talk about it some time ago. I need to finish the article for RAS BJ.
Oh, great!
Journal at some point. So once I do, I will share it with you. Anyway, I think we are nearing the end of this fascinating call. There have been so many positive comments in the chat box. So many people have expressed their gratitude for what has really been an amazing talk. I would say one of the best ones for RASBJ, and we've had a lot of great speakers. Before handing over the microphone, as to say, back to Alan, I would just like to remind everyone once again that there's so much more to see in this book, which I happen to have. You can order it using the link we shared in the chat box earlier. Blacksmith Books is a great publisher, and the postal service works very well. I had it delivered here to Jakarta in about 2 weeks, and it's a wonderful book for anyone who's interested in former treaty ports. So with that, and a great word of thank you to Nick